Hello, everyone. So today we're going to be talking about LBJ and his presidency after JFK, and then we're going to start on the civil rights movement. So let's go ahead and get to it. All right, so LBJ stands for Lyndon Baines Johnson. He is a Texas Democrat, came from very, very humble beginnings. He was not someone who was born wealthy, had to work his way up. He was not only president during his life, he truly had worked his way up. He was a representative. In the House of Representatives. He was a senator, a VP, and then eventually, whenever JFK died, he became president. He was considered to be a New Dealer with those programs that were meant to help other Americans in various walks of life, especially during tough times. And he really supported the New Deal early on, and he became a really good politician in the way that he could get things done one way or the other. After becoming president, he does carry on the legacy of a lot of JFK's programs that he wanted to make very successful. And here you get to see a senator by the name Richard Russell. He is receiving what's known as the LBJ treatment. This was something that he was known for. He was a very big guy, very tall, and he had a larger-than-life personality. And so if he wanted you to listen to something, if he's very passionate about something, or just a normal everyday conversation, he would get in people's faces and he would talk to them very close. Personal space meant essentially nothing to him. He was known for conducting business while he was in the bathroom. So he was a serious guy. So we're going to talk about his domestic agenda today. We will get into LBJ and his contributions during the Vietnam War later on in this unit. So first of all, we're going to talk about what he does at home. So first of all, you have a reduction in taxes, which was not necessarily unprecedented, but it was an interesting move on his part. And he felt that this would make the economy grow. And so we will talk later on also about how he pushes the Civil Rights Act through Congress. And so having somebody who is, trying to make the economy grow and who is, trying to ban discrimination, these are big moves. And these were things that were not necessarily started in the JFK presidency, but it's definitely a continuation of those policies. He did feel that there was a major issue with poverty, and that definitely was the truth. People who were doing well, but those who are struggling in their lives, they were truly struggling. So there are different groups with his war on poverty, that were targeted to really help them. So one of those is through Job Corps. Basically, Job Corps is, if you are ages 16 to 24, it helps improve the quality and satisfaction, really, of your life through vocational and academic training. So basically, it is a federal program, and it provides not only, a job, but also food, shelter, health care, and your job, really, and any kind of training that teenagers would need or young adults. And they had different campuses across the states. And he kind of took this from the Depression era CCC, which was the Civilian Conservation Corps. And it was, that was a relief program during that difficult time as far as our economy is concerned. And this employs lots and lots of people. It is free, and it still exists today. You also have VISTA. It's Volunteers in Service to America. Sorry. Brain fart. And basically, it's like a very domestic version of the Peace Corps. You also have Head Start. It came from the Department of Health and Human Services, and it provides early childhood education, health, nutrition, and helps with parental involvement. And this is for low-income families. It's supposed to really foster like a stable family relationship, enhance your emotional well-being, and to just give a firm foundation for families to grow and prosper, really. And so in 1964, he is actually elected, not just taking over as president, whenever JFK died, but you have a landslide victory over Barry Goldwater. And we will get to that when we talk about Vietnam. Okay, so The Great Society was his plan for progress. It was a legislative program. And so the idea here is to end poverty and solve the issue of racial injustice, make people have equal opportunities, and so on. So whenever he won in such a large margin, it made it to where he could really do a lot as far as his domestic policies go. So there are a lot of different programs that are a part of it, and education is a huge target for him. You have the Secondary Education Act. It's over $1 billion in the 60s for books and materials. Higher Education Act, loans and grants for college, so more people could go to college. Also, you see healthcare is going to be a major target of the Great Society. So you have Medicare and Medicaid. Now, sometimes Medicare and Medicaid can overlap, but mostly for Medicare, it's insurance for people over 65, and Medicaid is coverage for people who receive welfare. There's also the creation of with the housing and urban development, you have public housing that is going to be creative. You have public housing that's going to be put into place. For immigration, more immigrants are going to be allowed in with the 1963 Act because it's going to take away or limit those quotas for numbers of people coming from different countries who are coming to the United States. The environment is going to be a big thing. This is whenever you really see a lot of movement towards bettering the environment. We will talk about Silent Spring and Rachel Carson later on, but there is a major move to help improve the quality of water and thinking about our planet for years to come. So the Truth in Packaging Act, it seems very progressive era, but this was actually not continued, but it was essentially bettered during the time to where whatever you package in different, whether it's food or whatever, you have to have what's in the package actually be in there. Then you also have the Nation Traffic and Motor Vehicle Safety Act. It set federal safety standards for the auto and tire industries. Like for cars, you would have new safety features like headrests, steering wheels that would absorb energy, shatter-resistant windshields, and seatbelts. Seatbelts have not been around forever. You also have roads are going to be improved upon. Curves are not going to be quite as sharp. You're going to have barriers into oncoming traffic lanes, guardrails, and other things meant to protect the driver, essentially, and help traffic. You also have the creation of the Department of Transportation to help oversee these things. Now, the Warren Court is really going to be a big part of the 60s. It's called the Warren Court because Chief Justice was Earl Warren, and there are some controversial and some not so controversial, but still major decisions in the 1960s or under Earl Warren being the Chief Justice. First of all, you had the banning of school prayer, and this is probably the big controversial one of the time. There's a lot of protection of the rights of the accused, and this is something that was major during the time. Now, you learned about these cases in civics and economics or in AP government. Don't know why that took me a second to get out. But you learned about these different cases then, but we'll just kind of go through them a little bit at a time here. In Matt versus Ohio, basically, you have the protection against illegal search and seizure. So it goes back to this lady named Dolly Mapp, and she was convicted of possessing obscene materials. And after an admitted illegal police search of her home, and they were looking for a fugitive, basically. She appealed her conviction on the basis of freedom of expression, things like illegal betting slips and other things that you can go Google if you would like. So basically, like, this warrantless search was for a fugitive. There was nobody found in her apartment, but they found a pistol and other kinds of books that were considered inappropriate. And she was like, hey, a tenant left this behind. but officers, Lord, they found different things that was essentially prohibited under Ohio state law. And so this illegal search made it to where she, was able to file a suit. And she was eventually let off after her appeal. And basically, this case like leaves precedent against legal search and seizure. Now, you also have Gideon versus Wainwright. Basically, if you are arrested and you need a lawyer, you are required to be like provided with legal counsel. And where this comes from is a guy named Clarence Gideon. He was a burglary suspect. And this was in Florida, where they declined to appoint counsel for him. As a result, he was forced to act as his own lawyer and conducted his own defense, and he tried to emphasize his innocence. And at the conclusion of the trial, as most people thought would happen, it was returned a guilty verdict. And so they sentenced him to 5 years. So later on, you have a retrial for him. And you had a different law. You had a lawyer who was actually, they had credentials representing him, and they brought out the weaknesses in the prosecution's former case. So he was acquitted. And, most people think that he would have never been put in jail if he would have had someone provided to him. Next, you have Miranda versus Arizona. If you've heard of your Miranda rights, these are the rights you're supposed to be read. You do not have to write this, by the way, whenever you are arrested. And so Ernesto Miranda was arrested based on circumstantial evidence, and it linked him to several different crimes. And after 2 hours of interrogation by police, it's a long time, he signed a confession to a charge on forms that included a statement. However, at no time was he told of his right to counsel. And so he, had written out this confession and so on. And so after this decision, the Supreme Court, they set aside his initial conviction, and the state of Arizona tries him again. And after the second trial, his confession was excluded from evidence, and he was still convicted. But none of it made much of a difference for him, because he was retried. This time, without having his confession, he was reconvicted. But all that to say, whenever you are arrested, before you're supposed to be read these rights. And I know you've probably heard them on different TV shows and so on. These are your rights, and the precedent came from Miranda versus Arizona. So basically, the Great Society there and the Warren Court together, they changed a lot of how the United States really does function and protects the rights of the accused. Great Society was meant to help millions of people with jobs, health care, racial inequality, and things like that. But it is a controversial legacy, and it in this way is a lot like the New Deal, where you have people who benefited from it and were thankful, and even those who didn't benefit from it, there were some that still really felt like it was a good thing. However, there are others who felt that the government had too much power. They were spending too much money. So it essentially leads to a conservative backlash, especially like with the economy. And a lot of these programs are kind of put on the back burner whenever the war in Vietnam takes precedence. Great Society goes on the back burner. All right, everyone. So we're going to continue our discussion about the civil rights movement. So just a little bit of a background. 1909, going back a good bit, you have the formation of the NAACP, which is the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. During this time, actually, moving forward again, you do have a lot of legal efforts under Thurgood Marshall. He was the first African-American Supreme Court justice. And we're going to talk about Brown versus Board of Education here in a bit. He was the NAACP's first chief counsel, and so he is going to argue that case before the Supreme Court. You also have the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. Now, A. Philip Randolph is a leader, and he's the leader of that actual labor union that was for African Americans, and he is going to also be a leader for the civil rights movement. Um, this labor union branched off from working for the Pullman Company. We talked about those sleeping car porters. Jackie Robinson, if you're a baseball fan, then you've definitely heard of Jackie Robinson before. Otherwise, I hope you have heard of Jackie Robinson breaking barriers on the baseball field. Was the first African American to play in Major League Baseball in the modern era. He broke the baseball color line whenever the Brooklyn Dodgers started him at first base in 1947. They had signed Robinson, and this is truly the end of racial segregation in professional baseball, because since the 1880s, players that were black were playing in what was called the Negro Leagues. And eventually, Robinson was inducted to the Baseball Hall of Fame in 1962. So, a big deal for sure. So, just some more background. Segregation had been the dominant system in the southern states, and there were a lot of precedents that set this. First of all, you have Plessy versus Ferguson. We've talked about this case before, and it was in the 1890s. You have African-American train passenger by the name of Homer Plessy, and he refused to sit in a car for people who were black. He was arrested and jailed. Several states had mandated that train cars were segregated. And we have talked about Homer Plessy before because he was someone of mixed race. He said that he was 7/8 Caucasian and 1/8 African American. And so what was interesting was that this case actually rejected Plessy's argument that his constitutional rights were violated. And so Plessy had not been overturned, and it established that doctrine of separate but equal. You also have Jim Crow laws. These are laws that legally forced segregation and separated races, and it limited the rights of African Americans. The citizenship and African American suffrage amendments are going to be ignored, and the local laws are going to be enforced there. I don't know why citizenship has a white C, but you don't have to write citizenship. But keep in mind, it's really not just the South where you see prejudice. You do see it in the North as well. It's just more prominent through the South. And here is an example where you see water fountains are designated for people who are white and people who were African American. So World War II is really going to set the stage for the civil rights movement. What ends up happening is that African Americans had served like brilliantly in the war. We talked about the Tuskegee Airmen, and then afterwards you see that Truman integrates the military, so there are no longer any segregated units. African Americans at home had fulfilled jobs that people had left behind when they went to the war, and so the civil rights movement really takes off after World War II. It was the perfect time. It had been too long, obviously, but a lot of civil rights leaders felt that it was a good time, and you see it take off. Now, Brown versus Board, this is probably the biggest case that we're going to talk about. Basically, it overturns, and this is the Warren Court. Remember, we talked about the Warren Court with extending the rights of the accused, and the Warren Court's going to overturn Plessy versus Ferguson. I want you to put a star beside that first bullet. It's huge. And we'll talk about Brown versus Board again, but this is where the justices actually unanimously ruled that segregation based on race of children in public schools is unconstitutional. And where it actually happened, the whole name is the Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. You have a guy named Oliver Brown. He filed a suit after his daughter Linda was denied entrance into Topeka, Kansas. They have an all-white elementary school. They had multiple, In his lawsuit, he said that schools for children that were black were not equal to white schools, and that segregation violated the so-called Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, which itself says that no state can deny a person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the law. And so he said his daughter was not being allowed, and it violated that amendment. So in the end, you do see that Plessy versus Ferguson is going to be overruled. And whenever that happens, it is a huge victory for the civil rights movement. So the Little Rock Nine, I think I have a picture on the next slide. Yes. Now, we'll go back for just a second. Basically, you have 9 children. They were not allowed to go into Little Rock Central High School. The governor refused, and the National Guard was sent in. Eisenhower sent, keep in mind, we went back a good bit here. Eisenhower sends in his troops and takes control of the National Guard. And so this forces the school to let these children in. And I think I may have another picture after this, but you can see just the disdain and even the like just the pure anger in other people's faces. Rosa Parks, absolutely huge, monumental figure in the civil rights movement. So basically, you see that Rosa Parks, she was an African-American woman. She did not want to give up her seat to a white passenger. Remember, buses were segregated. So she is arrested, and eventually this begins the Montgomery bus boycott. This is where Martin Luther King Jr. Becomes prominent in the movement. He was a young pastor. I mean, he was pretty young. And this boycott lasts for over a year. And by the middle of the 50s, you see that the Supreme Court outlaws bus segregation. So a lot of major changes came because of Rosa Parks. And also, you don't have to write this, but there was another girl who had actually done the same thing, and it was before. She was a pioneer for the civil rights movement, and she was arrested at the age of 15 in Montgomery, Alabama, and she refused to give up her seat to a white woman. It's a similar story. And it occurred about 9 months before the incident with Rosa Parks. And so Claudette Colvin had actually, done the same thing at a very young age. And she says, this is a very famous quote actually from her. Whenever people ask me, why didn't you get up when the bus driver asked you? I say, it felt as though Harriet Tubman's hands were pushing me down on one shoulder and Sojourner Truth's hands were pushing me down the other shoulder. So just a brilliant story. All right, Martin Luther King. Montgomery bus boycott really puts him into the spotlight for the civil rights movement. He had multiple different influences in how he was within the movement. Nonviolent resistance inspired by Gandhi. You talked about Gandhi in world history. Civil disobedience was inspired by Thoreau. We talked about him with transcendentalism. And a mass demonstration with A. Philip Randolph. We just talked about him with the sleeping car porters. So he wanted to have some decent-sized peaceful protests, and he's a member of and founds the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And what's interesting is you do see that there are people that are supportive of Martin Luther King for quite some time. And we will talk about his assassination. Before that, a lot of key achievements. And here he is marching. All right. And so we will talk more about the civil rights movement tomorrow. Have a good evening.